tell us a little bit about your talk today.
Well, I'm talking about how to sustain solidarity in a time of diversity. So there's been a lot of debate in public and in academia about whether growing levels of immigration, but also just with the increasing ethnic and religious and cultural diversity of society, whether it's harder to sustain a sense of mutual concern of the sort that underlies the welfare state. So this has been called the progressive's dilemma, that there may be a trade-off between recognition of diversity and defending the welfare state. And I actually don't think there is a deep trade-off. I don't think there's a deep inconsistency, but I do think we need to be quite strategic and careful in thinking about how we try to reconcile diversity and solidarity.
How have those things changed, do you think, since the economic crisis started?
That's one of the interesting debates. There's one school of thought which argues that economics really drives everything, and that if we're living through a period of economic uncertainty and insecurity, that's when xenophobia arises and chauvinism against immigrants. It obviously doesn't help when there's an economic crisis. My own view is that, and I think the evidence suggests that the sources of hostility to immigration are actually not primarily economic. For example, one finding that shows up often is that most people in Europe would rather have a small number of immigrants who live off the welfare state, who are not economically contributing. They'd rather have more. They'd rather have a small number of immigrants who are an economic burden than have large numbers of immigrants who are economic contributors. So even though they would gain from having these large numbers of immigrants economically, because they're skilled and they contribute to the economy, they would actually rather have fewer immigrants, even if they're an economic burden. So this is a long-standing debate about how much of anti-immigrant sentiment is rooted in perceptions of cultural threat versus economic threat. And I think the evidence shows that it's perceptions of cultural threat that are more powerful. And so, yes, the crisis makes things worse, but it's in a way, the crisis just reveals cultural anxieties that were there all along.
So they were always there, and now they've become more visible.
Yeah, and more visible, but also more politically mobilized. This is I think the really worrisome feature of today's situation is that these anti-immigrant anxieties, which were always there, have become translated into support for far-right anti-immigrant parties. That's not predestined, and it doesn't happen in every country. And so I think that when those anxieties become crystallized in the support for a particular kind of political party, a xenophobic political party, that's when things can get very unpleasant.
The sentiment we hear in Britain, which is echoed by the political class, is that for years we weren't allowed to talk about immigration because we'd be dismissed as racist.
Yeah.
And now we're having a conversation. Is that legitimate?
Well, it is there's another area of ongoing debate about people amongst people in the field. So there is a view, as you've described it, that the elite for many years tried to discourage debates, open public debates about immigration, for fear that if you had an open debate about it, it would just, the lid would come off and all sorts of racist sentiments would come out, and so that's better not to talk about it at all. And that, I think there was a fair amount of that in many countries, and I think it's proven to be an unsustainable strategy, that if you try to suppress the debate, it just comes out in even worse forms, like in support for far-right parties. I think that there, you know, I don't think it's fair. It's entirely fair to say that the elites were suppressing debate for all those years. As someone who works with public policy makers, I saw them actually trying to in particular contexts, in particular places, trying to promote greater awareness of the benefits of immigration, better understanding of how the immigration policy works. And so it wasn't as if you just had this, you know, elite behind closed doors making decisions for everybody about immigration. There was a lot of discussion going on in those years. It just maybe it was unbalanced. Maybe it didn't allow not everyone was welcome to be part of those conversations. Maybe.
What's welfare chauvinism?
So that's the idea that a society should have a strong welfare state, but that it should be primarily for its citizens rather than for newcomers, and that therefore it's permissible and appropriate to make it harder and harder for immigrants to gain access to certain provisions of the welfare state. So this could be just a matter of putting time periods. So you have to be in the country for 2 years before you have access to, say, to unemployment insurance or disability benefits or whatever. But in other cases, it's not just a matter of how long you've been in the country. It's also that you have to prove your integration. And so they have, you know, you have to take courses in order to show that you've learned about society, or you have to do language courses. So it's often been the case in many countries that you have to pass a language test to become a citizen. That's a long-standing feature of many, many countries. But the idea that you have to pass a language test to gain access to the welfare state, that's new, and that's an example of welfare chauvinism. And it's the idea that these social rights, so the idea that citizenship depends on a certain level of integration, that's understood, and I think it's widely accepted. The idea that your access to fundamental social rights, healthcare and education and housing and disability and unemployment, that those things should depend on, you know, whether you've passed a language test. That's a new development in Europe.
In your opinion, is this a talking point designed to appease xenophobes?
Yeah. Well, in large part, it's that. I think in most countries that's the dominant impulse. But there are certainly some defenders of welfare chauvinism who argue that it's in the long-term best interest of the immigrants themselves that society not be too soft on them. So there's this kind of emerging discourse that we need to show tough love to immigrants, that if they're going to succeed in the long term, we shouldn't make it too easy for them at the beginning. They should have to work hard. I'm not a fan of that way of talking about it, but some defenders of welfare chauvinism think that in the long term it'll lead to better economic outcomes for immigrants. I don't think we have the evidence yet to judge that.
So we had years after the free movement of people of what felt like quite tolerant rhetoric and quite tolerant political feeling. In the last 5 years, things have become more hostile.
Yeah.
Which do you think is the aberration? Should we get used to this, or will it pass?
That's a very good question. So that's a very good question. I think you can make a case on both sides. So one reason for optimism, one reason for viewing this period as an aberration, is that if you look at public opinion in terms of generations, in terms of cohorts. Younger people today are just much more comfortable with diversity. They take it as normal and natural that they live in ethnically and racially mixed neighborhoods, that they go to mixed schools, that they have interethnic friendships. I mean, this is true.
They tend not to vote.
That's true. That's okay. Yeah, there are others, but still, in terms of just basic comfort with diversity, that's the world that they've known. They don't experience diversity as a kind of unnatural change in what they were used to. That it's what they were raised with. It's what they take to be natural, and so I think, and we know that this is true across many countries, that it's the older generation that's much more anxious about diversity. Even though, interestingly, and this is goes back to the point about cultural versus economic threats, the people who stand to benefit most economically from immigrants are older people, because their pensions are dependent on the input of working-aged people, and our pension schemes would go bankrupt in many countries if it weren't for an influx of working-age immigrants. But the resistance to immigration is often highest amongst the elderly, because they experience it as a cultural threat. They may realize that they benefit economically, but they experience it as a cultural threat, and that's what worries them. But anyway, so that if you look at it from this kind of generational point of view, I think European societies and North American societies are the future. The younger generations and future generations will simply be more comfortable with diversity. On the other hand, I think that these dynamics are connected to larger geopolitical contexts and dynamics. And so, I mean, the 9/11 bombings really changed the world. They really did. So we since 9/11, we've been living in a world in which issues of diversity have been connected to issues about terrorism and national security. And so when I was debating issues about religion and education in the 1990s, there were lots of different views on all sides, but no one said that we can't have faith-based schools because there'll be schools for terrorism. That argument, which is now very powerful in many countries, is a result of 9/11, and so I hope and expect that someday we will end this war. That things will change in the larger world, so I think that the ability of a society to successfully manage diversity does in part depend on on those issues not being constantly compromised or filtered through the lens of security and terrorism and so on. It's just very hard to have a kind of generous and welcoming and accommodating approach to diversity if at the same time in the back of your mind you're thinking that this is really an issue about how to manage terrorism and violence. And so,
or the welfare state.
Or the welfare state. Although I think, as I said, I'm although the focus of the talk is kind of on the welfare state, I think the economic issues are actually more manageable. I think that it's true that in many countries immigrants tend to be employed at a lower rate, so they have higher rates of unemployment, say, and they may not be doing as well in school, and so it's not. But nonetheless, I think there is a strong economic case for the benefits of immigration, particularly with aging societies, and that there's no reason why immigration should be seen as a threat to either basic economic prosperity or the sustainability of the welfare state. So I think the economic issues are tractable. I really do think that at the end of the day, how well we deal with immigration is going to depend on how well we deal with the cultural anxieties. And some of those are purely domestic, but some of them have this geopolitical dimension, and that's harder to predict.
And what can institutions like the EUI contribute to this conversation, do you think?
Well, I think that the debate on immigration in most countries is very parochial, if I can put it that way. I'm from Canada, and Canada's a paradigm example of this. We talk as if we're the only country in the world that is a country of immigration, and that or the only country that has multiculturalism. So we don't think of ourselves as learning from other. We don't try to learn from other countries. I have been banging my head against the wall trying to encourage people in my country to think about the benefits of comparative scholarship on issues of immigration. So the EUI is obviously perfectly located to be a forum for sharing of experiences. I think there's actually a lot of success stories and failures across Europe and across the world on how these issues are dealt with, and so often I see countries reinventing the wheel that they could have actually learned from what has worked and what hasn't worked in other countries, but we don't tend to listen to each other very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.